What's going on, everyone? How are you? Got another interview today. I got Brian back on the channel. We're going to be talking about the controversial figure, Paul, from the New Testament. There's a lot of different divisions in Christianity, and some of them not really too kind on Paul. I'm just going to get right into it. Hey, Brian, how you doing?
Doing awesome. How you doing today, Micah?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
I'm good. So, the topic today is Paul. Now, real quick, do you want to tell people basically, if you want to explain who? Hey, can you hear me?
You're going in and out a little bit.
Oh.
Are we both going in and out?
How about now? Is that a little better?
You sound good. Yeah, you sound fine.
Okay. All right. So my first question, I guess, was basically, do you want to tell people who this guy Paul was, or his original name was Saul, right? He was another guy in the Bible that they changed his name, right?
Correct. Yeah, he originally went by Saul, and Paul is actually a bit of a mystery. He showed up on the scene, I think it was like 16, 17 years after the event people know of as the crucifixion occurred. And what really appeared to me that it looked like what he was doing was he saw, or maybe I should say, the Roman government saw this movement that had been created by Jesus or Yeshua or Jesus, as it's in the 1611 King James Bible. And I'll just refer to him as Jesus from here on out. Don't want to trigger anybody with the whole name situation, but I think that the system saw this thing going on, this situation going on, and that it was actually going to lead people away from Rome and make them more independent. You know, they're going to exercise their own self-determination as far as taking care of each other, which is not what any government really wants. The government needs the people to be dependent on the government. If you're not dependent on the government, there's no need for a government, is there?
Mm-hmm. So basically, but who was he though? Was he from a specific group of people? What was his basic purpose?
Well, Paul grew up in Herod's court. All right, I've likened him to like the family of the Bilderbergers. Looking into Paul, it appears that he was a tent maker or a leather worker. And stop and think about what kind of things would they really need. You know, he wasn't working for Camping World of the day. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so what he would have been doing, from what it appears to me as with the court of Herod, was he would have been taking care of the troops. He would have been supplying the needs of the military. You know, when it comes to leather working and tents, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. That's what really makes sense. And at the same time, also realizing what he was doing. And, you know, like I said, it was just kind of weird how he just kind of appeared on the scene and nobody knew anything about him, you know, until like, 15, 20 years after the time of the crucifixion.
Do you know when he's first mentioned in the New Testament? I'm not going to ask you the exact quote, but do you?
Yeah, well, it would be from
the circumstance.
It would have been from one of his own texts, and that would have been, I would say, the book of Acts is where you're going to be finding mention of him. And there's 3 different places in Acts, chapters 9, 22, and 26, specifically where he talks about what he was doing, and those kind of lay out his road to Damascus story and also his day in court. And so, and further back also in his growing up, it's really crucial to remember that he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. All right. Gamaliel could be compared to predecessors like Plato or Socrates or Aristotle. It would have been in that vein of an education that Paul received. That's where he came from. And I think that's extremely important to realize, especially if you're looking at the situation where he was in court and there was the prosecutor there, and the prosecutor was getting really frustrated with him. And I think, I've said a few times, I think it's important for people to put their feet in the sandals of those first century people. Too often we try and look at situations from the first century with 20th century eyes, and it doesn't work that way, because the whole society was different. How people related to each other, especially, was very, very different. And so when you're looking at a situation like where he was in court, anybody reading that today would be, I don't know, a lot of it would go in one ear and out the other because it wouldn't make sense to us. We wouldn't comprehend what was going on. But Felix, the prosecutor for Rome, or for Herod's court, Felix makes a mention to him. He says, "Have you gone mad? You of much learning." Well, why would he refer to you of much learning? Have you gone mad? Well, the reason why is because Paul was bringing up information that they knew. These people in that day and age knew, because he mentioned his experience on the road to Damascus and says that Jesus said to him in Hebrew, and it's important to remember, Jesus supposedly spoke to him in Hebrew, okay, and said, "Is it hard for you to kick against the pricks, or hard for you to kick against the goads?" And that's when the prosecutor, Felix, was like, "Hey, dude, what's wrong with you?" Because that was a saying back then. We don't realize that today, but back in those days, they knew that saying very well. And it came from a Greek play called Boukai that had taken place about 500 years prior to them. Like I said, just prior to like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates coming on the scene. And so it was something that they would say within their family, it's like, dad threatening the son, yeah, I'm going to kick your butt for that. You know what I mean? Well, that was the same kind of saying that they were using, but they were taking it from that play. And so Felix was like, even the king is well learned. We know this stuff. So here he's like making up a story and trying to apply it to himself and to an experience that he had, which just would sound totally ludicrous at that time. And people need to, comprehend that we see things like that written in writings that don't make sense. We should go back and research it so that it will make more sense to us. And I think one of the funniest things about that story of the road to Damascus was that Paul, fortunately, was the only one that was blinded in that situation. Now, he gives 3 different accounts of that story, and they're all kind of nuanced. They're all a little bit different from each other. But it's fortunate that only Paul was the one that was blinded. That way, these gentlemen could lead Paul further down the road and head into Damascus, because Paul was supposedly blind for 2 or 3 days afterwards, something like that. And at the same time, it was fortunate because if Paul's going to come out and say that Jesus appeared to him and spoke to him, well, guess what? This would have been close enough to the time of Jesus that a lot of people would have remembered him. And they might have said to him, "Oh, really? You saw Jesus? What did he look like?" Well, guess what? Fortunately, Paul claims he was blinded, so he wouldn't be able to identify him, would he? He would only be able to say that this entity claimed to be Jesus. So I think that's something that Paul kind of wrote into the storyline just to kind of cover his butt, just in case anybody asked him, okay, who did this guy look at? Prove it to us. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I got that. Now, why is he so controversial? Because you have all these denominations in Christianity. I forget how many of them. I want to say 8,600, but I could be wrong. There's a lot.
Over 30,000.
There's more, okay, so it's way more than that. Actually, I was way off. Okay, these are all divisions of different Christianity. I'm always careful not to lump Christianity and Catholicism together because they have very different tenements. And people who just think that Christians and Catholics, because they believe in Jesus, are friends, that's not the case at all. But you have a lot of denominations that are for Paul and then some denominations that are against Paul. Can you take us through that a little bit and maybe give us some context to that?
Well, from my experience growing up in Christianity, or as I call it, churchianity, I think the majority of the denominations are all pro-Paul. And that would even include the Catholic Church. Myself, I've said a number of times that the Protestants, never left the Catholic Church. They're just protesting it. Well, you can protest something all you want. You can march on Washington all you want. You're still a citizen of that federal government. So go ahead, protest away. You're not going to change anything by protesting. But I think a lot of people, and I notice more and more people today, because I thought it was strange for me, especially growing up, never going to a public school, always going to a Christian school, and growing up and looking at the writings of Paul. Something just didn't feel right. And I think more and more people are leaning that direction today. When I first started speaking out about this, I was really expecting a whole lot of Christians to come forward screaming out, "What's wrong with you? Are you an idiot? You need to read your Bible." That really didn't happen. And the reason why that doesn't happen is because where does this knowledge come from? It comes from the Bible. It comes from the words of Paul. He tells you himself that he is a deceiver, that he will do whatever it takes, to bring you into the word of Christ Jesus. Well, what does the system do today? The system turns everything upside down. It turns everything backwards. And that's what Paul does. Paul doesn't come forward. He isn't saying that he's providing the message of Jesus Christ. He says he's providing the message of Christ Jesus. He turns it backwards. And in fact, Paul even says, "I'm giving you my gospel." He never says he's coming forward. Isn't he supposed to be teaching the gospel of Jesus? Instead, he's saying, "No, I'm giving you my gospel."
So this stuff
and I think one of the reasons why so many people are starting to turn their back on Paul is because, and I would really recommend to any of these Christians, whatever out there, go and read just like the red letter words in the Synoptic Gospels. Read the words that came from Jesus, and then compare his teachings to what Paul is saying, because you're going to find there's actually a big twist that Paul puts on things. And that twist that Paul has put on things is what the denominations today in churches are teaching, which to me is a 100% complete falsehood. Now, you mentioned the two different names, Saul and Paul. People need to realize at that time, you're dealing with a Latin situation, and you're dealing with a Jewish situation. You've also got a Greek influence. And so Saul would have been his Jewish name. All right. That would have been the common name for him. But at the same time, you're dealing with Latin people, and you're dealing with Rome, and his Roman name would have been Paul. Nowhere on that road to Damascus story is there a place where his name was changed. Like you see with Jacob's name being changed to Israel, for instance. You don't see that occur in his story. That somehow, even though that seems to be a big part of it, he forgets and leaves that out. Now, I said earlier, it's important to remember that he said that Jesus spoke to him in the Hebrew tongue. So if you go to the Hebrew tongue and look at that road to Damascus story, it starts out with, this blinding light and Jesus saying, "Shual, Shual." All right. He's not calling Saul Saul. A lot of people might think that, but that's actually Hebrew for question. Question. Why are you persecuting me? That's what's being said. So that's the closest place in that story where you're going to see that name Saul is actually where Jesus is supposedly saying in Hebrew, Shaul, Shaul.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that kind of
Well,
curious.
you've got
And somehow or another, I don't know. It doesn't really seem like Paul is coming out telling people to change his name to that, because even when he gets to Damascus, he's still being called Saul. You know, he goes to the house that supposedly Jesus tells him to go to, and the man at that house is even calling him Saul still. So no, there's no evidence of a divine name change.
Mm-hmm. You can still hear me, right?
But I want to say at the same time, we have to remember that he even claims that he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. So if you go back and look at the things that he would have been reading, the books he would have been studying under Gamaliel, you're going to find so much of those things line up a whole lot more with what Paul's writings actually are. He writes probably about 13 books out of the 27 books of the New Testament, which I find pretty interesting. That must have been a really huge download that he got on the road to Damascus, which I also find curious that in that event that Jesus commands him to go to Damascus. Well, gosh, that just fits his story perfect because he's already on the road to Damascus. He's already going there. So, yeah, that doesn't seem like some big divine commandment to me.
So do you see Paul as more like a Joseph Smith type figure?
I missed what you said.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? One sec.
All right, he's bouncing out and he's going to try to reconnect here.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, you sound good.
All right, good, beautiful. What I said was, I've been trying to jump in, but what I said was, do you see Paul as kind of like the Joseph Smith type person, character, personality, archetype, maybe?
Yeah, he actually could be, similar to a Joseph Smith or, somebody that says, hey, you want to create a business, start your own religion. You know what I mean?
That was L. Ron Hubbard, right?
L. Ron Hubbard did that. And I believe it was also a statement made by the same gentleman that started the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And people who don't know, when Brian was talking earlier about the red lettering, they call it companion Bibles. You can get one because they have little information on it, but a lot of the Bibles, what they do is it's all in black, but the words that Jesus supposedly physically said are in red. So it's easy, it's color coded, so you know when Jesus is talking or not. That's what I think Brian was referring to.
Yes, exactly. And I think, it's important as well. People need to pay attention not just to what is written, but also look at what's not there, because you're never going to see Paul quote Jesus. He never talks about any of the miracles of Jesus. He never talks about the virgin birth of Jesus. These are all very likely not brought up by him, maybe because they could have been inventions. Just a hypothesis there.
Right.
But
Well,
something that
there's an astrotheological explanation that we go into that my work very well. That that explains it. It is multi-layered for sure. I tell people this. I say I'm an author, right? And what I have done is I've created these characters that do not exist in the real world, though they are archetypes for people who do exist. If you can figure out the anagrams and the things that I have encoded in there, it'll tell a different story. But these are real places. Like at one point they're in Minnesota, at one point they're Egypt. I didn't create a universe like Lord of the Rings, right? A lot of the things they say is based on a true story or loosely based on a true story, right? So that's basically the thing with the Bible. You get all these writers that are writing from their vantage point at the time. Because Brian, you also have to remember, a lot of these punishments that they were doling out was because the time that the Bible was read, the Code of Hammurabi was still so prevalent. as far as everything goes. And that's maybe not where they get all their punishments, but that's how they get the structure on how to judge others and to make the punishments. But yeah, no, there's a lot of there's. Do you know? Could you talk a little bit if you know about the denominations that may be for Paul or who's turning away against it? Because you sound like you're pretty anti-Paul in that, which is fine. I never had an opinion one way or another, to be honest. In fact, believe it or not, Brian, the like Paul wrote the letters to the Corinthians and all that stuff too, right? So you got him doing all that, but in the sections where Paul is talking, there is no astrotheology in those particular chapters. It's almost like it was someone else literally writing this that didn't understand what the patterns were, because it's throughout the Old Testament minus 3 books, and it's in the 4 Gospels, it's in Revelation, but then the rest of the stuff is Paul, and there's no astrotheology in that. It's almost like someone directly interjected it.
Well, you're also going to find astrotheology in the extra biblical texts as well, and Zoroaster and these other places. And that's one of the things that I found actually very curious. I can't believe you brought that up, because I was thinking about that the other day. Is I was going through the text of Paul, trying to find, is there any place where there's anything that could be alluding or depicting astrotheology, and there's nothing there.
Wow.
I mean, it's like neutral, it's generic, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I want to mention as well, because I had brought up that, that there's never a mention of the name change on the road to Damascus. He doesn't quote Jesus. He doesn't mention the miracles of Jesus.
Just for proper context, Brian, can you, because this people are thinking you're going down to the DMV to like change your name when you get married or something. Can you explain what a name change would have meant? Are you talking about a spiritually divine one, or are you talking about a physical name change? How would it have been done back then?
All right, yeah, I'll hit on that. Let me just finish with this. So that no virgin birth was mentioned, but also one of the biggest lies that's taught in churches today is that Paul was persecuting, or Saul was persecuting the Christians. If you go into Acts and read Paul's own words, he never says that he was persecuting Christians. He was persecuting followers of the way. That was the teaching of James. James was moving forward with the teachings of Jesus, and it was referred to as the way. And that was who Paul was going after. We're Christian, didn't come along till later on by Ignatius of Antioch, where that word Christian pops up, and it was a Greek word. Now, as far as like name change and what it would have meant back at that time, this is one of the things I think that many people get very confused when they're reading scripture or some of the other writings. There's over 40 other authors from the first century that we have writings from. And when we're seeing a lot of different names, even in the Old Testament, you're seeing different names that you think are separate people. They don't understand. People were given that they had a birth name, then they might have been given a priest's name, then they might have been given a prophet's name. They might have had 3 or even as many as 4 different names that one individual in Scripture was going by.
And also in Hebrew at the time, you were talking about Saul and Paul, the letter, the name change, right?
Right.
The letter J came into the alphabet in 1524. It is the last letter that came into the alphabet. The letter Z came in before the letter J. 10 years later, the Jesuits come in. And then like 70, 80 years later, the King James Bible comes out. But if you go back, Jesus, aside from the fact that he was called Emmanuel or Jemanuel, that was his original name, because that's the first mention, and he shall be called Emmanuel. He's also called Yeshua. But Yeshua doesn't translate to Jesus if you translate it. There's no Y in Hebrew. Well, there technically is a yud, but it wouldn't have been Yeshua. The proper translation is not Y to J. Because in Hebrew, Jonathan is Jonathan, Yaakov is Jacob. There's no J.
Right.
right? So Yeshua would physically translate to Joshua, which is why I believe he's called Joshua at a certain point, because that's how you would translate it. His
Yeah.
name was Jesus. His name was Joshua or
Yeah.
Emmanuel.
Right. Josh would have been a lot closer. I remember there was a gentleman, he's since passed away. I was learning Hebrew from. And when I first started talking to him about it, because he was an Israelite, and I mentioned something to him about learning Hebrew, and he kind of looked at me and squinted his eyes. He says, "Why? Why do you want to know Hebrew?" You know, and he was very suspicious, in his question of it, and that's because that language isn't just their language; it's also their code. Because the Hebrew language isn't just represented by numbers. Numbers signify the letters, or rather the symbols. The symbols all stand for something, and all those symbols also have their own definition to them. So you can take one word like a name and grab a whole story just from that name or that one word, which is really interesting.
Right. And the other thing, when they name people, Jesus would have been called Yeshua ben Yosef or Yeshua ben Pandera. That would have been his name. And what it is Yeshua or Joshua. Ben means son. So Yeshua ben Yosef is Joseph. Joshua, son of Joseph. That's how they introduce you in Hebrew. That's how they still introduce you to this day. They'll add into the
Well,
name.
and it's like the man that Jesus replaced on the cross was Barabbas. Bar, also like Ben, means son.
Mm-hmm.
So you take the name Barabbas, and what do you have? You've got the son of Abba. You've got the son of the Father.
Yep.
And so,
There's a lot
you
of
could
etymology there. It's crazy.
twist that, yeah, twist that any way you want. But Jesus replaced the son of the Father on the cross.
Mhm. It's so deeply encoded. It's just,
Yeah.
I feel like I just get mad that people are not looking any deeper into things. They're just like, oh, this makes sense. This is fine. I'll be fine with this. This is fine. No, use your mind. Use your head. Open up. Um,
Well, I recommend people go back and check out the speech that was given in 1969 by Dr. Day. And one of the statements, Dr. Day, because what he was doing in his speech, he was constantly saying, talking about the future, saying, this is what we are going to do. Okay. And he was talking about all the changes that would be coming up in the future. And one of the statements that he made all through that speech was that one of the problems was that people don't ask the right questions. And you're nailing it right there. That we just so quickly just assume stuff and don't even stop and think about it or ask questions, and we just keep steamrolling ahead when we really need to take a moment and stop and ponder what we're really reading and what we're really looking at, because there could be a whole lot deeper meaning, a much deeper story within what's happening there.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
there was a situation. My mom called me up here. It was probably 6, 8 months ago, and she was telling me about a story about a place where her and my earthly father had gone to church at. And it was one of the last services that they had attended at this church, because they ended up taking like 3 offerings at this church, right? And what they were doing was they were raising money to build a new church, which they did end up doing, and they built it about 10 or 15 miles away, further away than even the people that walked to their little local church who donated all this money could even attend, right? Well, in the service, this preacher gets up and he's waving this money in the air, you know, $3,000 or whatever that some other church had sent them. And he's saying, this is seed money. This is seed money for a new church. He says, you know, don't let us be embarrassed by this other church. We need to raise money. We need to use this seed money to move forward in building our new church. And like I said, they ended up taking like 3 different offerings during that time. And the last offering was actually, put your ring in the offering plate, put your watch in the offering plate, you can come by and buy it back later if you want,
Where does the
but
concept Where does the concept of tithing come from? And I
Yeah.
don't want you to go into
Right.
prosperity gospel yet, but I do want to touch on that. But where does the concept of tithing and the percentage come from?
That comes from the Old Testament. But just to finish up on that story really quick,
Sure.
um, it, when my mom told me that story, I'm like, gosh, that rings a bell. So a couple of days later, I called her up. I says, you know what? You know where that pastor got that story from about this other church donating this seed money, and don't let him be embarrassed, by not raising as much money as this other church did. That story came from Corinthians. It came from 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul did the same exact thing, where he was saying, look, the Macedonians, donated so much to me. He said, don't let me be embarrassed. We need to live up to what the Macedonians have done. So that pastor was just copying a story straight from Paul's playbook.
What do you think Paul's intentions were? I'm not sold that any of these characters in the Bible, including Jesus, maybe they're based loosely on certain people from the time that the authors might have known, but they're certainly, if anything, I think they're more archetypes, and if anything, I don't think any of them ever existed. I mean, every story, you talk about Solomon, Saul, On, 3 names for the sun. You talk about Samson and Delilah. Samson means little son in Hebrew. The root of Delilah is night. It's the story of the night taking over the day. This is different ways of the hero's journey in the sun. This is
Right.
all these stories basically are. And what really, I guess, what really interests me, I guess, is let's assume he's a character at this point. Maybe he's based on someone. But what do you think the writers of Paul intended his purpose to be, or how he saw himself?
I think what they did is they saw this as a perfect opportunity to create their own fear, blood, and guilt control matrix to control people, and to use religion strictly as a tool of control. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't some good knowledge in things that Paul wrote or in other parts of Scripture, but I think it was seized upon by Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what they did with it. And it's one of the things I find frustrating today is so many, we were talking about the Protestant churches, so many of the Protestant churches, they want to push back against the Vatican. But what are they doing? They're following all the dictates laid out by the Vatican. It wasn't even just Paul that did this. Eusebius of Caesarea, he said the same thing. He said, that maybe we can deceive people.
You'd be surprised how many people on my Facebook, people that I've grown up with my whole life, that are Catholics, that try and tell me that I'm wrong and also try and go after the Protestants too, man. I'm like, I'm not getting in the middle of your little holy war that you guys are never going to finish. That's what they want to do. The Protestants always want to attack the Catholics attack the Protestants, and then the Christians want to attack the Catholics because they don't believe that Mary is divine. That's
what this whole system does, is we're trained, and I've noticed the same thing whenever I meet somebody. They'll ask you certain questions because what they're trying to do is they're trying to put you into a box that they can identify. Now, once they get you into that box, that now they feel like they're more comfortable in being able to respond to you and talk to you. And you were talking about the historicity of some of these characters from some of these older writings or from Scripture. And you've got Josephus, who is one of the probably more prolific writers, from the first century. And Josephus even mentions Jesus only but one time.
Okay.
And it refers to him, he says, Jesus the man, if I can call him a man. But here's the thing. Even scholars today have determined that this mention by Josephus only appeared in some newer writings that came from Rome. It may not really have been in his original works.
I want to pivot away from Paul or Saul, and I want to turn to Josephus too, because I want people to understand who he is. I'm really happy you brought this guy up. This guy, I can't think of somebody that is quoted more as proof that Christ, the man flesh, existed more than him, or I couldn't even tell you. I couldn't even tell you. It's like it's basically it's or Ron Wyatt, for example.
Maybe Justin Martyr if you're going back to the first century. Justin Martyr's writings. He was a very prolific writer, probably
He's
right
not
next
often
to
talked about, and he's not often quoted. It's
right,
the
and
whole
that's
problem with Shakespeare and Marlowe. They were contemporaries. They
right.
were brilliant, but unfortunately, one had to be more popular than the other. It's the same thing with Josephus. Josephus, so many Christians pin on him. Do you want to talk a little bit about Josephus's writing and who he was and how he came to and when he lived and all that stuff? Because
Well,
Josephus was a real person.
yeah, and Josephus might have just been a pen name.
Right,
Um,
right.
it might have been a pen name for Paul, also known as Saul.
Really.
These very likely could have been the same man. I find that actually a pretty interesting rabbit hole in itself, right there. So when you're looking through some of the writings of Josephus, it's like, wow, some of this because different writers they have a different feel to them, the way they communicate, and it's like, gosh, it seems like I know this guy. You know what I mean? So if you're somebody that was a Christian, is a Christian, brought up in Christianity, and you're used to reading, Romans and Corinthians, Galatians, Thessalonians, all these writings of Paul, and you're going to go, you know what? I'm seeing some parallels here. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, why you said we don't hear much about like Justin Martyr. Well, we aren't provided a lot of these writings. You have to go and find them yourself. But today's system and even the church isn't going to provide these things to you because you're going to start seeing some holes in the story that you've grown up on. And you're going to suffer some serious cognitive dissonance. You yourself are going to find yourself kicking against the pricks.
Would you like to drop some of that right now? Some of these holes that you talk into?
Well, yeah, some of these holes. I mean, I would say, I think some of the best writings as well is to go and even read these gentlemen that were writing the Dead Sea Scrolls and that were preserving the stuff at that time. Is and I did an episode on this a while back, but you're going to find that these are your original self-help gurus. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And is the message that they were talking and the message that Yeshua or Jesus was spreading is not the same message that the church spreads today. The church today, they say, oh, you've got to be born again. And some people may know like what the sinner's prayer is. Well, you know what? None of that's even biblical. Go find that in the Bible. You're never going to find it. Where you will find that at is in Pilgrim's Progress. You're going to find that written by Paul Bunyan years and years and years later, centuries later. None of these things that are pushed by the church, just they don't hold up to a background check. Bottom line, Christianity or churchianity today does not hold up to its own background check. When you go and look at their doctrines and find the things that were actually spread by the Way or by James or by Yeshua, they don't hold water. And in fact, and Paul even mentions this. He says, supposedly people think I'm supposed to come with letters of accommodation, which meant that, anybody that was spreading the message, they were supposed to get letters of accommodation from James. He didn't have any of these. He said, no, me just being here telling you this is enough. I don't need letters of accommodation. Well, you know what? He even needed letters of accommodation to persecute the followers of the Way. And he would go to Rome and get his letters of accommodation from Rome in order to do that.
Why would it be James? Because I thought in the Bible there's the whole argument that Mary Magdalene was supposed to continue the church. There's the whole argument that in the Bible you see Jesus literally tells Peter, "You are the rock." Right? He tells Simon Peter that it's basically he's to continue the works. So why would they have to go to James?
Okay, well, if you go to I believe it's in the secret book of Thomas. Actually, Jesus says is that it was for James that he came. It was for James that this world was created. And he actually passes the mantle down to James. It's a Catholic Church that tries to depict that the mantle was passed down, or the baton was passed to Peter instead, because of that line that you brought up, where Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church." Okay, this is a figurative situation, and I want you to think about this. Wrap your mind around it. We see this especially with Islam. In fact, you see it with any conquering nation. What do? They go to wherever the capital is of that nation and they plant their flag. What did man supposedly do when he supposedly went to the moon? He planted his flag, right? And that's what Jesus was doing when he made that statement to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." Okay, people think of this figuratively. Hold on. Where were they when they said that? Where were they at? They were on Mount Hermon. What is Mount Hermon known for? Mount Hermon is supposedly where the angels fell, or these spirits fell from heaven. They landed on Mount Hermon. That was their landing place. And that's why Jesus
Michael?
stood there and said, "On this rock, I will build my church."
So that was the place where Michael fell?
I don't think that Michael was one of the fallen angels, but supposedly Lucifer, there's a whole host of, to me, almost unpronounceable names. But
I always tell people there's a book that was written in the 1870s that got banned by the Catholic Church. It's still banned. It's from a guy named Anatole France, and it's called Revolt of the Angels. It's the battle in heaven against God from Lucifer's point of view, his fall to earth, and his eventual recline back up to take God on once again. It is heavily banned by the church. It's called Revolt of the Angels. It's an incredible book. It gives Jesus. I mean, it gives Lucifer the not the TV show Lucifer, but like Al Pacino Lucifer in Devil's Advocate.
Yeah.
It gives him that kind of thing.
Well, I think it's interesting as well that, people, if they know this story, that these angels or the watchers were to have said that, they came together in a pact. They made an agreement. They made an oath, right? Well, there was a stone found on Mount Hermon that is now at the British Library. It used to be on display. I don't believe it's any longer on display, but it actually had the oath written into that stone that was found on Mount Hermon.
Really?
Yeah. So I think it's kind of interesting when you read or hear some of these older stories, and then you find possible physical parallels that line kind of right up with what you heard.
Have you heard of Ron Wyatt and all his work?
Yes. Yeah, very familiar with Ron Wyatt.
What do you think of him?
I find it very curious. I'll say this. Yeah, I've never been open about this before. About 3 years ago, I was in a meeting that it was supposed to be a closed meeting, and the information wasn't supposed to be released from the meeting, which other than seeing that somebody had recorded on YouTube, I haven't heard anybody really discuss what happened. But since it was released on YouTube, I want to mention what was happening in this meeting is that they're using some ground penetrating radar to see what could be found. And we're looking around that area of the Dead Sea Scrolls there, and found what would have been like a temple area there as well. And what was also discovered was a extremely large cache of precious metals, gold, silver. And when I say a large cache, I mean huge. And I've watched since then. I've kind of kept my eye out on the area because I've kind of expected, maybe Department of Antiquities or, somebody from the Israeli government to go and start digging up that area around Qumran, on the caves there. And I haven't noticed it happen yet, but it was very, very convincing evidence that there was a large cache of things down there, one of which could have very, very closely resembled the Ark of the Covenant. All right. So now, with Ron Wyatt's story, that he actually saw it underneath Golgotha in one of the caves there, and that the blood from the cross actually dripped down onto the ark.
And
I don't know.
For people who don't know anything else, he's also supposedly found Sodom and Gomorrah, and has found pure sulfur balls in the wall, like pure sulfur, like they're more pure than they are here. He supposedly found the crossing of the Red Sea. He found a whole bunch of like chariot spokes and wheels in the wall.
He found Noah's Ark.
He found Noah's Ark. It was in Turkey, I believe. And it's just he's an interesting character. He's very, very polarizing, though. But
a friend of mine has actually been over there to the Sodom and Gomorrah area and brought back some of those sulfur balls.
Yeah.
And one of them, a piece of one of them, him and another friend, they got together one night and they said, let's burn it. Let's check this stuff out, see how flammable it is. And they're like, and they're glad they did. They went like outside, back behind the house to do it. And they lit it on fire. They said it was the worst possible smelling thing you could think of in your life. Mm-hmm. I mean, if anybody...
The strongest smell in the world is a manufactured chemical called thioacetone. I write about it in one of my books. I think it's the third book that I wrote. I wrote about thioacetone. It's sulfur-based. And what it is when you smell it, you could smell it half a mile away. People would be throwing up from it. It's sulfur is what it is. And that's why they say that a lot of demonic entities, when they visit a room, they leave traces of smell of sulfur, right? It's alchemical in that sense, too.
Absolutely. Yep. And if anybody's ever been on like a golf course that uses the sulfur water to water the golf course with or anything, oh my Lord, you talk about a horrible smell. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, that would definitely, and I've heard that many times, that is a smell that is left behind. It's kind of a trace of, an entity having visited, a room or a building or something like that, or that maybe you are even in an area that you should stop and think twice about whether you want to be in it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. When the crazy conspiracy theorists guys talk about lizard people smelling like sulfur, that's where this stuff comes from.
Yeah.
So let me just bring it back to Josephus for a few minutes, though. What was his title, and what do you think his lasting accomplishment was? What do you think his works point to?
Wow, it's hard to really put a finger on one thing, because I think whenever anything happens, whether you want to call aerosol spraying in the skies, which is something I would actually like to touch on really quickly, but aerosol spraying in the skies, or 9/11, any of the situations that occur, the killing at JFK, they're never to accomplish one thing. They're always set up to accomplish multiple things at different levels. And, I think the same thing was with Josephus as well. I think part of it was to dissuade people against or away from the teachings of Jesus, whereas other people used it to hold on tighter to a lot of the events that were going on at that time. I think as a whole, if I had to put my finger on one thing with Josephus, I think it was to keep a categorized file or remembrance of the things that the Jewish people have gone through. Because you just, look at the books like Antiquities of the Jews or War of the Jews, okay? So that's really, I think, as a whole, what the first intent was to keep a record of what people, the powers that be, whoever, wanted us to think of or believed to be the history of those people.
Right.
And that was probably the number one reason.
I always mention this too. I say the Jews wrote the Old Testament. They took away the divine feminine being worshipped, and they replaced it with woman being the cause of sin, and childbirth now not being a blessing where you're a portal that brings new life into this world, that you're forever intrinsically attached to this child. No, birth is now a punishment for the deception in the Garden of Eden. But then it goes even further. You have the New Testament. There were no Christians writing back then. The New Testament was written by Jews too. In fact, it was written mostly by Hellenistic Jews because the New Testament wasn't really written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek. And then you start to tell people this, well, the original Greek translation for things don't actually say homosexuality in Leviticus. It actually says boy molesters. The word is arsenokotai. And you can look that up in Greek, boy molesters. Martin Luther, that started the Lutheran Church, his Bible said Nabenchander for that. And Naben means boy and Shander means molester. The first time homosexual was translated to mean, or it was translated in the German Bible, for example, was in 1983. So you go into all this stuff and you realize that people are literally fighting endlessly for things they don't understand.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. We lose so much information when things are being removed from the Hebrew into another language. You're losing so much of the knowledge of what that word really was about. And if anybody questions that, talk to somebody that has actually had their boots on the ground as part of the military or whatever in the Middle East. Ask them about that word over there in the Middle East and what they know about it. I mean, look at the Botcha Boys in the Middle East. If anybody's, this
Botcha
today
Boys,
is
guys,
still.
for people who don't know what Botcha Boys are basically, they're young, very young. They're like maybe 7 to 10-year-old boys that dress up like girls and dance for older men.
Hey, does that sound familiar in America today? Hello.
Yeah,
like Rex Bear says, hello.
It's everywhere.
Yep.
It's everywhere.
But I think people need to go and search out as many of those older writings, these older books as you can find. You brought up like the Divine Feminine. Go and pull up the book Gospel of the Holy 12 that references the Divine Feminine. We have to realize that whenever anything's being created, whether it's in nature, if you're going to have flowers created, you've got a bee pollinating one flower to another. There's always a male and female aspect to everything. If you want to have a child, guess what? It's going to take a man and a woman to do it, right? At least until our new and improved test tube babies come out. But you're always going to have both sides. And the same thing, in your spirituality.
It's Hermeticism. I think it's the same principle. It's the principle of gender.
Yeah, hermeneutics, exactly. Yep, hermeneutics. Yeah. And people look up, the laws of hermeneutics, and you're going to see it's like, oh my gosh, you see those things used today, whether it's in religious settings or even if it's just in general society. You see these rules of hermeneutics constantly being applied, and because they basically are maybe one of the closest things to natural law. Yeah. And by saying that, I guess everybody's going to call me a demonologist now. But anyway,
I've had a demonologist.
So was your King James before the King James Bible came out. He wrote the book of demonology.
People don't even realize that King James was gay, and he wrote a demonology book too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm not sure what his sexual proclivities were. I didn't live at that time, but yeah, there's definitely some interesting stories for sure.
Fantastic. Well, so Brian, would you be so kind as to tell everyone where they can find you?
Yeah, somehow or another, Facebook has left me alone, so I can be found there, Brian with a Bryan. My dad was very insistent that my name was spelled with a Y instead of an I. I think I've recently maybe figured out why that was. But yeah, I'm on Facebook. You can find me Bryan Parker Tactical Sovereignty on WordPress, and the same name used on YouTube. So
Perfect. All right, Brian, I'm going to email you this file right now. Well, I got to download it first. So let me download it and email it to you, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for coming on.
absolutely, you and everybody else have a blessed day.
Thanks, man.